Hello, Mr. Piland's class. This is the U.S. joins the Vietnam War. These notes will be essentially the reasons why the U.S. joined the Vietnam War at a time when most Americans did not even know where Vietnam was. It all relates back to our conversation about the Cold War and the official American position on communism. American government said that as long as communism exists only in Eastern Europe and Russia, we were okay with that. So if we saw communism appearing in the rest of the world, we would do something about that. Well, there was a communist uprising in Vietnam, and so that was, in our minds, Vietnam was communism spreading. So we decided that we wanted to do something about that, and we were going to help the South Vietnamese fight against the communist Northern Vietnamese. So this is the U.S. fights communism around the world, and Vietnam is one of those places. In order to understand this conflict, what you really need to understand is that in 1941, Japan, along with other nations in Southeast Asia, were very interested in getting rid of the old colonial forces that used to, or colonial nations that used to control them for many years. If you remember back from the age of exploration in world studies, you remember that the Dutch and the English and the French and the Spanish went out into the world and conquered much of these areas of the world and had them held as colonies, because they wanted the spices in those regions and the resources in those regions. So they had been there for a very long time. The Vietnamese were very mistreated as well as undermined by all of these colonial forces. Many of the nations in Southeast Asia, China, Japan, were angry and very interested in finally kicking these people out of their area of the world. And they were hated. France was hated by the Vietnamese because they had been there forever and controlling Vietnam. So in 1941, Vietnamese communists and nationalists decided to have an uprising against the French forces. They found it a little easier to do this at this time because in 1941, well, most of the French military was busy fighting World War II. So most of the fighting men were actually in Europe, in France, fighting the Germans at this time. So with a smaller army that the French had in Vietnam, the Vietnamese were able to force the French out of most of the country. And most of the country, I mean, they actually were able to force the French forces south into southern Vietnam. So the country then at that point became a little divided. The northern half of Vietnam became Vietnamese and interested in communist type governments, and South Vietnam was still somewhat controlled by the French, but also a capitalist type of economic system and democratic government. After World War II, more and more French regained control of Vietnam. They were able to dedicate more soldiers after World War II was over to try to reclaim Vietnam, but all they could do was regain control of the southern half of Vietnam. By that time, northern Vietnam was very heavily fortified and under control of the communist Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh is his name, and he was the leader of the Viet Minh, or the northern Vietnamese communists. They controlled northern Vietnam after France took over the south. He turned northern Vietnam into a communist economy. He also promised to liberate the south from French control and reunite the country. Remember, many Vietnamese were so tired, it's hard to explain, but so upset with French colonial control of their country that they began to hate all nations that were interested in colonizing Vietnam. So they were very angry and very interested in uprising against these types of forces. So Ho Chi Minh promised to actually continue what he'd done in northern Vietnam and do it to southern Vietnam as well, and kick all French and all colonialists and all people interested in democracy out of Vietnam altogether. So the war broke out between France and northern Vietnam, and whatever southern Vietnamese there were still living in the south. The Geneva Accords was a meeting held in Geneva to determine the future of Vietnam in 1954. There was Ho Chi Minh, who was in control of the North, and he was a communist. And then there was a leader named Diem, and that was the leader that was in control of the South. He was a pro-capitalist, pro-Western, pro-colonialist leader in South Vietnam, and he was essentially in control of South Vietnam because the French had put him there, put him in a position of power because they knew he was going to continue to have a good relationship and trade with the French. In 1954, there was a ceasefire at these Geneva Accords. They determined that the North and the South would stop fighting against each other. It divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, which is the difference between the red and the yellow that you can see on this map. North Vietnam would stay above the 17th parallel, and South Vietnamese and the capitalist government and economic system would stay south of the 17th parallel or below it. So the election of 1956 was designed to reunite the entire country. So the 1956 elections, when the elections to reunite the country approached, Diem, who was the South Vietnamese leader, the capitalist pro-Western leader, he canceled them. And he claimed that a fair election could not be possible. So the U.S. actually supported this decision to cancel elections. Well, who do you think it angered? It angered a lot of Vietnamese pro-communists. It angered the North Vietnamese a lot. And the U.S., of course, supported this decision because they wanted the country to remain a capitalist nation. And Diem, I believe, knew that he probably was going to lose the election, and that's why he canceled it. So this further divided the country and a lot of the citizens that were living there at the time. Now, the U.S., of course, wants Vietnam to be an independent country. They want them to be able to rule themselves. They don't have a ton of interest here, but they also have decided that containment is their policy on communism. And they fear that the communist forces in Vietnam are much stronger and much more vehement than the other forces in Vietnam. So they fear that Vietnam is going to actually fall to communism. And then they have this theory that if Vietnam falls to communism, that will be the third country in that region of the world to fall to communism. First it was China, then it was Korea, and now it's Vietnam. If Vietnam falls to communism, what's to keep the rest of the countries in Southeast Asia to fall to communism? The U.S. has just spent a great deal of money and effort trying to rebuild Japan after World War II so they could gain back the trust of Japan and rely on them as a trading partner and a very good friend. They can't afford to see the rest of Southeast Asia and possibly Japan fall to communism. So they decide that their position is they need to do something about it. Between 1961 and 1963, President John F. Kennedy increased the number of American military advisors in Vietnam. At first, what the U.S. did was support the South Vietnamese with military personnel. They would send men over to Vietnam with military experience, and they would advise the South Vietnamese army on how to protect themselves and how to fight the Northern Vietnamese. By 1963, there were over 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. Now, you can probably argue that if you have 16,000 military advisors in a country, you are no longer advising a country on how to fight war. You are actually going to war. And that was something that was only going to get worse as time grew on. The United States tried to kind of hide or ignore the fact that they were really sending a lot of soldiers over to Vietnam to help fight this war, and over time they would just escalate it even more to the point of a full-on war. These U.S. advisors give support to the South Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese were fighting the Viet Cong, or VC for short. And what you would hear in movies and TV is the name of Charlie given to the North Vietnamese army. The reason why is because in code speak, VC, you would say the words Victor, Charlie, and so they just shortened it to Charlie. The North Vietnamese army was made up of regular army that fought in uniform during the day, but unfortunately there were also quite a bit of VC or Viet Cong army that blended in with South Vietnamese. They were farmers during the day. They were, regular people during the day that lived in South Vietnam and would attack secretly or guerrilla style at night. And so there was a lot of preparation and planning and advising by the American Army that just had no bearing whatsoever. The enemy was very secretive. They fought guerrilla style and they couldn't be detected. So the war was very hard to fight in general. The spark moment of Vietnam that got the United States finally involved in more of a full-out war with the Vietnamese was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2nd, 1964, according to reports, the battleship, two American destroyers were doing routine checks in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is right outside North Vietnam. So they were kind of in territory where they knew that things could happen. It was almost as if they were almost baiting the North Vietnamese into doing something. And so on August 6, 1964, according to reports, the North Vietnamese actually torpedoed 2 American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. And those torpedoes never hit the destroyers, but they were detected by the sonar guys that were on board the destroyers. So when this word got back to President Johnson, and by this time President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Texas, and his vice president, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, had taken over as president, Johnson claimed the attacks were unprovoked. He said that we did not do anything, they fired upon us in the Gulf of Tonkin. So we decided to retaliate. Congress was unwilling to declare war, but they gave Johnson the ability to do quite a few things. They gave him a lot of military control and retaliate on behalf of the United States of America. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was when Johnson addressed Congress. He also addressed the American people on public television. He asked Congress for the powers to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Well, this is just a fancy way of saying he wanted all the guns, tanks, bombs, weapons, and soldiers that he could possibly muster up, and he was going to send a lot of boys and a lot of military over to Vietnam in the hopes of defeating the North Vietnamese, even though it wasn't called a war because the Congress never declared war. He had enough power as president to go over there and do whatever he wanted to as far as sending as many military personnel and material as possible. Alright guys, you decide. Should Congress pass the resolution for LBJ? We were reportedly torpedoed off the coast of North Vietnam. We are already sending 16,000 military advisors into South Vietnam to help them maintain a democratic country, a capitalist country that will hopefully stem the tide of the domino theory that we were talking about. If Vietnam falls, we can't afford to let Vietnam fall. And so should Congress do this? If Congress doesn't declare war though, but it does give the president this type of power, what does it allow the president to do? What kinds of things is he capable of if he gets this power. So that's something also to weigh. We'll talk more about this in a couple of days when we do the Gulf of Tonkin incident in class. But for now, take these notes down, review them, and know about the decisions that led us into Vietnam as a country. Talk to you soon, guys. Thanks. Bye.